Hello and welcome back to session 5 of Decolonising the Body, the 2021 Decolonial Summer School programme. So this week's topic for discussion is race. As I said in the first recording for this session, from the late 19th and early 20th century, we saw the emergence of a body of pseudoscience known as the racial sciences that attempted to establish there was some kind of scientific biological difference between different human beings that was in turn used to justify and legitimate ideas of certain humans as superior to other humans. As I mentioned, one of the most disturbing examples of where that thinking took us was the Holocaust in World War II. But as I also mentioned, it wasn't only Nazi Germany that engaged in this practice of pseudoscience and used this thinking. Another place that is often associated with the racial sciences is the United States, and particularly the ways in which African Americans were studied and in turn categorized as inferior to white Americans. As a result, many of the discussions about race and racism have focused particularly on the issue of blackness. And in another recording, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to a group of thinkers known as the Afro-pessimists, who have argued that the category of blackness requires much more attention and requires specific attention that is different to other forms of racialization. Some provocative and interesting claims. But what I want to do in this recording is to focus on blackness in a different way. And that is the ways in which certain black thinkers and activists have identified blackness as a source of not just stigmatization and dehumanization, but as a source of empowerment, of community building, and of solidarity. I think this approach is a really interesting and important one for any of us interested in the decolonial project. And I think this for three reasons. One, as I said in the introduction to the idea of the decolonial, one of the really damaging ways in which colonialism has affected us, and even in the aftermath of colonialism continues to affect us, is the ways in which history has been told through a certain construction of who are the agents, namely it's been white European men, and who have been passive objects of history. So bodies on whom violence has been enacted, who have been categorized, who have been exploited, who have been dispossessed. In this process, even when we have attempted to resist that, sadly, we've often not been able to escape that positioning of ourselves purely as these sort of passive objects rather than agents in our own right. And I suppose one of the ways in which I think of this particular approach to blackness that black thinkers have adopted as productive is they're attempting to speak back to that. So one example of this is the book Black Atlantic by the British black intellectual Paul Gilroy. What Gilroy argues in that book, which other black thinkers have also suggested, is that if we only tell the story of the transatlantic slave trade in relation to the violence, degradation, dehumanization, what we do in that process is erase all of the richness of cultures that those people brought across the Atlantic with them, the new cultures that they forged in their relationships with each other, the ways in which black people not only survived the horrendous conditions of slavery, but actually found ways to be creative, to think and to speak back, to resist, and to tell stories about themselves and about their lives and experiences. What Gilroy tries to do in Black Atlantic is to document some of that and to say that that is as much a part of the story of modernity as the story of the dehumanization of black people through the transatlantic slave trade. He does this through the example of music, where he points to the incredible vibrancy of black musical traditions that emerge even in spite of all of the violence, but also often emerge as a result of the ways in which black people have been deprived in the slave era and even afterwards of certain access to education, certain political rights and access to the public sphere. And so what Gilroy points to is the ways in which music and dance offered another space in which theorizing could happen, essentially, and ways in which Black people could express their political views and demonstrate their capacities, even though they were deprived of that space elsewhere. So I think this is a really important part of the story that we also need to be telling, that the processes of colonization were definitely violent and definitely dehumanizing in lots of ways. But to only tell that story means that we accept that we are only passive objects in this rather than active agents, sometimes complicit in processes of colonization and domination, and sometimes resistant to them. And how do those histories of resistance help us to think now in our contemporary world about what it might mean to change the ways in which we approach our lives and the world that we live in? The other thing that I think these thinkers contribute is not just to documenting the capacities of people who have been assumed to be nothing more than enslaved laboring bodies, but to also show us that many of the concepts that emerge from the project of Western modernity, tied up as it is with colonialism, are not just ideas that Europeans had and that the rest of us just got by osmosis, but rather many of these ideas emerge through not just what Europeans were thinking and doing, but also through what others were thinking and doing in different parts of the world. So one example of this is the Haitian Revolution. Many Black thinkers have turned to the Haitian Revolution, so the revolution that happened at the end of the 18th century on the Caribbean island of Haiti, where slaves rose up and overthrew their slave masters in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity. The very same claims that were being made in France, where peasants were rising up to overthrow the aristocracy and the monarchy. What is interesting to tell in that story is that now when we talk about the histories of democracy, or we talk about the idea of human rights, often it's told as a story of European values. It's told through the idea that ideas of equality and freedom emerge as a result of the French Revolution and maybe the US revolutions. What we don't acknowledge is actually those ideas of freedom and equality were not just being articulated by French peasants, they were being articulated by Black slaves in Haiti as well. So how do we think about these concepts as not just the product of European thought, but actually product of many different people's engagements with these ideas at particular times? So this is one of the things that the thinker C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian scholar, tries to set out in his book, Black Jacobins, about the Haitian Revolution. The other person who might be of interest, and I'm naming these people because I think it's really important for us to recognize how often these other histories and these other thinkers have been written out because we don't cite them enough. But the other person I would refer to here is the African-American Marxist thinker, Cedric Robinson. So what Cedric Robinson argues is that processes of racialization actually predate Europe's engagement with Africa. For Robinson, racialization first happens in Europe, where in the system of feudalism, the serfs, the peasants, were racialized in particular ways. So he argues that the concept of race existed well before Europe encountered the Negro in Africa. This is important for Robinson because what he's interested in is taking up Marx's ideas and thinking about Marxism as an incomplete story without the story of race. This, I think, is a really important and productive conversation, because what it does is it shows, on the one hand, that there is a value in engaging across different communities, different histories, to try and point out commonalities of experience. But on the other hand, also what Robinson does is he adds a dimension that Marx himself was not able to add, because he didn't have a perspective beyond Europe and what he knew of Europe. So, and in some ways, one could argue that if we look at the state of capitalism now, that the form of Marxism that might actually be more useful for us to actually think about critiquing and overthrowing some of the violence of capitalism is probably the Robinson version, informed by black Marxists who saw race as very fundamentally part of capitalism, than the traditional Marx version that didn't take that into account. Because I think most of us would see that global capitalism now definitely draws on ideas of race and racial inequality as a part of its processes. So this is another way in which I think acknowledging the contribution that black thinkers make is important to the decolonial project. The final way that I think it's been important is as a gesture of solidarity, as a way of trying to think about a connection and cosmopolitan ideas of cosmopolitanism that are not about domination. So, for example, many of these black thinkers were interested in thinking both about their own local contexts, but also their local contexts in relation to other parts of the world. So one of the founders of US sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, when writing as an African American about the experience of African Americans, was really interested not just to talk about what was happening in terms of race and racism in the US, but also to talk about how that was connected to Africa and how he might also see or feel a sense of solidarity with other parts of the colonized world, including parts of Asia. So what I want to remind us is that blackness has another history and another connotation, and that has been one of trying to assert solidarity, a solidarity of different oppressed peoples, a taking up of the standpoint of those oppressed peoples to say this offers new knowledge, but also to say this is a gesture of reaching out across our differences to try and find ways in which we can still share, express our common humanity, and be engaged with each other. And to sort of conclude, what I'd like to say is that in the context of the UK, the figure of the black intellectual has a very rich history in post-World War II Britain, and one of the most prominent black intellectuals of the 1970s and 80s was actually a Sri Lankan, Amalavana Sivanandan. Sivanandan came to London in 1953, and it describes how shocked he was to be called black. But rather than throw off that black label and suggest that he would distance himself from that, actually Sivanandan embraced the label of blackness and turned it into an incredibly powerful political and intellectual tool that he used for many decades afterwards to speak back to the UK on its racism against its various migrant populations, many of whom came from its former colonies. He also used that position to speak out against contemporary forms of colonization, whether it's through, UK involvement in things like the War on Terror. He saw the connection between the lives of poor Asians and black people in the UK, not only amongst themselves, but with other poor oppressed peoples in other parts of the world. And also he was always attentive to the forces of global capitalism, which meant he wrote very sympathetically about the white working classes in the UK, that even though they are often identified as the source of racism, that for him he saw the problem as more the various forms of global oppression, racism and capitalism being entwined with each other, that meant that all of these different groups were pitted against each other rather than seeing their commonalities and seeing the possibility for solidarity. And that's where a label of embracing, a blackness might actually be a productive way of speaking back and resisting.